Warning. This episode contains references to sexual violence. Listener discretion is advised. There are thousands of bodies buried in the fertile soils of El Salvador. Deep beneath the volcanic ash, feeding the coffee plantations in the mountains. The practice of burying multiple bodies in a common grave goes back centuries. When the conquistadors killed with swords and plagues. When the government massacred our indigenous people in the 1930s. Often, common graves are marked with nothing more than 2 sticks in the shape of a cross. A simple memorial to lives lost.
After pushing the bodies into the grave, the villagers covered it and placed a simple cross made out of tree branches on the grave. I always thought it was just some little twig cross. And it was big, 3 feet tall, this cross. And I think it was very obvious that the campesinos wanted this grave to be found. Otherwise, they wouldn't have marked it that way. That's my opinion on that.
That's Sister Cynthia Glavick, an Ursuline nun from Cleveland, Ohio. And she's talking about a common grave that was discovered in the afternoon of December 4th, 1980. 4 women's bodies had been found sprawled along the roadside in the village of Santiago Nonualco. Local campesinos had found the women and buried them together in a shallow grave. This is 9 months after Oscar Romero's assassination. By this time, the country was teetering on the brink of all-out war, and finding bodies along the roadside was becoming more and more common. But one detail about these women stood out. So much so that one of the villagers who was there went back and told his priest about it.
The sandals was an interesting detail because the Salvadoran women, didn't wear any shoes. So the fact that these women had sandals, it was like an identifying item that they were who they were, that these were the missionaries.
Four American missionaries had gone missing. They'd been coming back from the airport in a big white van when they just disappeared. So when the priest heard about the women in sandals, he immediately raised the alarm. He called the American embassy and the U.S. ambassador, Robert White, who we heard about in the last episode. White went to the gravesite and asked the local authorities to dig up the bodies.
The bodies were unearthed and pulled out of the shallow grave one by one with ropes. First Jean, then Maura, then Dorothy, and finally Ida.
This graphic moment was caught on film by reporters and broadcast all over the U.S. Sister Cynthia was one of the people watching on TV.
Those bodies being pulled out of the grave over and over again on TV, I think that just reinforced the brutality of this, the whole thing.
For Sister Cynthia, this footage hit especially hard because she recognized some of these women from back home.
We were especially shocked in Cleveland because Dorothy and Jean had lived among us. So when they were found in a shallow grave in this deserted cow pasture, this news made headlines in every local and national news program and in every newspaper. Their deaths brought the tiny country of El Salvador and its problems to the attention of the entire world.
The news that 4 American churchwomen had been killed execution-style in El Salvador broke in the United States like a bomb. It was the first time that the general public in the U.S. had heard any detail about what was happening in El Salvador. Oscar Romero had been murdered earlier that same year, but the murder of these 4 churchwomen would bring a whole new level of international scrutiny. This moment became a litmus test for the United States. What would they do about this heinous crime? Were they willing to keep funding a war that had killed its own citizens? The answer would reveal a murky cover-up and would threaten the relationship between these two countries. I'm Jasmine Romero, and this is Sacred Scandal, Nation of Saints. Episode 4, The Nuns. I don't know about you, but when I think about nuns, I generally picture them walking around in clusters around a cathedral, heads bowed and counting their rosary beads. What I don't picture is nuns canoeing.
I just have this memory of us laughing, kind of screaming on the river, wherever we were in some park, and trying to maneuver the canoes.
But that's how Sister Cynthia remembers her time with Dorothy Kazel, one of the 4 churchwomen who were sent to El Salvador. Not as a nun, but as the vibrant and dynamic woman she was.
She was very outgoing. She had a huge smile, a lot of energy, the ability to make you feel special.
Cynthia first met Dorothy when she joined the Ursuline Sisters of Cleveland in 1973. But it turns out that Dorothy and Cynthia had actually grown up in the same place.
Her family lived on the same street as I did, Shoreview Avenue in Euclid, Ohio. They lived 6 doors away, so I knew her parents pretty well. So when I told her that I was from Shoreview Avenue, she called us the Blondes from Shoreview because she always had nicknames for people.
Sister Cynthia is now the director of archives for the Ursuline Sisters of Cleveland, and she wrote a book about Dorothy after her death. It's called In the Fullness of Life. And in the process of writing her book, she researched deeply how her fellow sister came to be in El Salvador and what her time there was like. In the 1960s, the Pope had asked religious congregations to send missionaries to Latin America to support the new vision for the Catholic Church. Dorothy immediately knew that she wanted to be involved.
Sister Dorothy wrote a letter volunteering, and she mentioned that she had always had this desire since she was a child to serve the Spanish and Indian people. She said she wanted to stay there and get to know them and help them.
In the summer of 1974, Dorothy landed in El Salvador. This was well before Oscar Romero was named Archbishop, before Roberto D'Aubuisson had death squads, before the pressures of the country would boil over into all-out war.
Wednesday, around July 31st, I think. And we arrived here on Monday afternoon. Our plane came in early. It was about 4 o'clock. We had a beautiful flight. The flight down was really nice.
Throughout her time there, Dorothy Kazel recorded audio cassette letters that she sent back to Cleveland.
The country is really exquisite. It's mountainous and green, very green right now. And you really have to see it to appreciate it. It really is beautiful.
Tapes that describe her new life in El Salvador. Listening to her, it kind of reminds me of my own reactions when I arrived. Taking in the beauty, but also the poverty of this place.
When you pull into Lago, you just pull off onto a dirt road, which is really rocky and pitted. So we went around the village, and it, as I say, it's very poverty-stricken. It's just something you get used to living with and used to looking at. It is amusing to see these pigs trotting around, though, too. Big pigs, little pigs. Big cows, little cows. Big bulls, little bulls. All over the place. It's different.
Dorothy worked with priests in ministering to the community. She worked in 3 different parishes and was eventually sent to the Immaculate Conception Parish in La Libertad.
They planned and organized celebrations of the Eucharist and other liturgies. They played music and conducted choirs for the liturgies. They prepared adults and children for the reception of the sacraments. They also visited the sick.
She also trained Salvadorans to be religious teachers. She distributed food to mothers and young children as part of Catholic relief programs. She and the other nuns, they became a real presence in the area.
Now, whereas a priest could only visit his entire area once a month, the sisters and lay women visited their areas, all 10 or more villages, weekly, alone, and usually on horseback or by motorbike because of the rough terrain. So, since the women served as such a vital link of communication between the parishes and its parishioners, the sisters really guided the work of the parish.
Dorothy committed to stay 6 years in El Salvador, from 1974 to 1980. In those 6 years, she became part of the community. She slowly learned Spanish, learning the names of the towns that she was working in, and she grew to love the people that she was helping. And they, too, loved her. She became known as Madre Dorotea. In 1980, her term was ending, and she was due to go back to Cleveland. But then, Oscar Romero was killed.
Everybody's just in a state of shock because, it's just, he had just given this beautiful, beautiful homily on Sunday, very strong. His message was very strong. He says, and to the soldiers, I have a special message. He says, I beg of you, I plead with you, in the name of God, stop the repression, don't kill. Oh, and then here he is.
Dorothy was at Romero's funeral. You can see her in the photos that were published from that day, standing by his casket. She was inside the cathedral while the bombing and the shooting was happening outside. In letters back home, she describes the horror of that day, watching the bodies of those killed be carried into the cathedral. Soon, Dorothy would be faced with a choice, one that directly tied to Oscar Romero's assassination. That's after the break. It was clear that the situation in El Salvador was rapidly deteriorating. The Bishop of Cleveland worried about Dorothy and her safety, but he also knew how much good the missionaries were doing. After Romero was assassinated, the bishop asked Dorothy if she wanted to come home or stay for another year.
She said, well, of course I will stay,
But this wasn't the same El Salvador that she had arrived to. In her 6-year stay, the political landscape had completely changed. Tahuizon's TV programs and death squads were fully operational. In 2 months, the leftist guerrillas, the FMLN, will declare war on the Salvadoran government. Suddenly, Dorothy and the missionaries are not just spreading the word of Jesus. They're tending to wounded civilians and assisting people who had become refugees within their own country.
A call would come for one of the gringas to transport refugees from a bombed-out village to a refugee center.
The women helped refugees find whatever they needed: medicine, shelter. All 4 of the church women who were murdered in El Salvador were involved in this kind of humanitarian work, including Mary Knoll's sisters Mara Clark and Ida Ford, and lay missionary Jean Donovan.
So anyway, with their white Toyota van, Dorothy and Jean, who had been called the rescue squad by Maura and Ida, traveled through the hills, moving food, supplies, and refugees to refugee centers. They distributed medicine to the sick and wounded people, took them to medical clinics. They couldn't take the people to government hospitals for fear the people would be killed there.
It was clear to the sisters how bad things were getting. especially as they were working in and around towns with heavy guerrilla presences. They saw a lot of death.
On Friday, the next day, on the 23rd, they found their bodies. And Martha, they were hacked. One of them was decapitated. I mean, it was just gruesome, just gruesome. So, it's just, why? Why?
I couldn't believe, how these people can endure all of this.
It's just been, something's been happening like every week. Every day in the paper, like 10 bodies found in Santa Ana, 5 in Ahuachapán with EM Escuadrón de Muerte written on them, another 12 in San Miguel. It just gets to be too much sometimes. It's so sad, and it's just like so out of control.
But Dorothy was determined in her decision to stay.
She wrote, "I could not leave Salvador, especially now, because I am committed to the persecuted church here."
Now, I don't doubt for a moment Sister Dorothy's resolve and her desire to help. But there's also something else that influenced her decision to stay.
They were well aware of the danger, of doing that type of work, and they were fearful. But because they looked so American with their blonde hair and blue eyes, Dorothy and Jean believed that they were safe.
Whiteness. Americanness. It was a kind of unspoken protection that they carried. Dorothy wrote in her letters that even the local priests liked to have the American women with them when they walked around, because they knew it was a kind of armor.
Jean used to say, "They, the military, don't shoot blonde, blue-eyed North Americans." And Dorothy said, being a gringa is an asset. They wouldn't do anything to hurt you.
But that protection only went so far. On Wednesday, November 26th of 1980, Dorothy and Jean were invited to visit the U.S. ambassador, Robert White, at his home.
They had met at a Thanksgiving ecumenical service the week before, Thursday before, and they were talking about the political situation. And White said, "Well, why don't you come? We'll continue this conversation. Why don't you come to the American embassy? However, because of the curfew, please bring an overnight bag, so you could stay overnight."
They spent the night, and the next day, Sister Dorothy and Jean went to the airport to pick up Sisters Maura Clark and Ida Ford, who had been at a conference in Nicaragua.
So the plane landed at 7 o'clock. Dorothy and Jean greeted Maura and Ida, and they proceeded to the baggage claim to pick up their baggage there. And while they were waiting for their baggage, they chatted with a group of Canadians who were arriving and kind of milling around there. The Canadians then got their luggage and said goodbye.
That's really the last time that anyone saw the 4 women alive. The next day, the pastor at Dorothy's parish went to Dorothy and Jean's apartment. He was confused when they weren't there. He and others in the surrounding parishes started to make phone calls, searching for the women. The American ambassador, Robert White, and the Minister of Defense were alerted. And several of the sisters themselves started to search. 2 of them drove to the airport. On their way, they spotted a burnt-out vehicle, a wreck surrounded by police, a large white van that looked familiar. When they got to the airport, they asked around about the nuns, showing their photographs. Witnesses confirmed that they had been there. When the sisters got home, they looked up that white van's serial numbers.
And the numbers listed on the van's registration papers matched the numbers stamped on the motor block of the abandoned, burned-out van. So they knew that that was their van.
The women's bodies would be found the day after they went missing. But now, the question was, who had taken them and why? That's after the break. The bodies were buried in the red clay earth of Santiago Nonualco in the Salvadoran hills. local campesinos were ordered to reopen the grave and pull up the bodies of the 4 church women. When they were exhumed, U.S. Ambassador Robert White was there. Just 3 days before, he had dined with the women. Now, he watched their bodies being pulled from their shallow grave.
It was apparent they had been executed military style. In the back, they were probably forced to lie on the ground, face down, and they were shot. By the way, Dorothy was shot twice. She was shot in the shoulder. They missed her head. I know that sounds horrible, and she moved.
The investigations that followed showed that the women were not only murdered, they were also raped. Almost immediately, Robert White suspected that the Salvadoran government and the National Guard were involved. Sister Cynthia interviewed Robert White for her book in 1993, and he told her that he began to think that something was fishy when he talked to the Minister of Defense, General José Guillermo Garcia, on the phone.
He told Garcia that the women were missing. The first thing Garcia asked was, were they wearing habits? Ambassador White then said that he had a very, very bad feeling, this is in his own words, because that's the kind of standard defense that they make.
As if not wearing habits, not being recognizable, could have led to their deaths. This question, it got to the very core of the religious persecution in El Salvador. What he was really asking was, were these traditional nuns who wore habits and stood with the elites? Or were these part of the new and radical church that, in their eyes, stood with the communists?
But I do think that because they were working with the poor, this seemed to be the pattern with the military, that they were considered subversives and they were maybe even being watched. I think that, maybe that was it.
Whatever the reason, the killing of 4 Americans in El Salvador was an undeniable shock to the United States.
Up until that time, American citizens had not been killed.
When the women were killed, Jimmy Carter was president. Like we mentioned in the last episode, Carter was concerned about human rights abuses. But he was also hesitant to clamp down on the Salvadoran government. Up until this point, he had resisted any calls to suspend aid, including a letter from Archbishop Romero himself, sent a few weeks before his death. In the letter, he pleaded with Carter to stop supporting the Salvadoran government. But the murder of the churchwomen would finally wake up the American public and force President Jimmy Carter to take action.
After the bodies of the women were found, the United States, and this was under President Jimmy Carter, announced that it was suspending military and economic assistance pending clarification of the circumstances of the killings of the women.
Following the announcement of the churchwomen's murders, the U.S. government sent 2 State Department officials to conduct a preliminary investigation. They would look into the killings of the churchwomen and whether the Salvadoran government had been involved. They sent FBI specialists to look at the evidence, fingerprints, and bullet fragments. All the evidence pointed towards it being Salvadoran National Guardsmen who were responsible for these murders. To this day, there are still holes in the timeline. But here's Sister Cynthia, paraphrasing the FBI's report.
The women got into their white Toyota van and proceeded to leave the airport. And at the first toll station outside the airport, National Guardsmen, Sergeant Luis Antonio Calendra Aleman and 4 other guardsmen ordered the women to vacate the van. And then after they interrogated the women, the guardsmen ordered them back in the van, got into the van with them, and proceeded to drive the van in the direction of the town of Santiago Nanualco to a deserted area, a dirt lane by an empty field. And Calendra Aleman then ordered the women out of the van. The guardsmen then proceeded to rape the women. Afterwards, they killed the women execution style, and left the bodies along the roadside.
Afterwards, the women's van was driven outside of La Libertad. Their personal items were removed, and so were the license plates on the van. The killers then
took a can of gasoline and poured gasoline on the inside and outside of the van and set the van on fire.
This information was all based on U.S.-led investigations. The U.S. State Department wanted the Salvadoran authorities to conduct their own independent investigation and find out if these National Guardsmen had acted on their own or on higher orders. The Salvadoran government assured the U.S. that it was doing everything it could to figure out what had happened. But really, there was already a rushed cover-up happening. The guardsmen had been transferred away from their airport post right after the murders. And they'd had their rifles exchanged so that the ballistics couldn't be traced. For months, Salvadoran authorities reassured the U.S. and continued to hide the truth. But the families of the women and U.S. Ambassador White would continue to speak out and insist that there was a bigger cover-up at play.
The argument was always that these lower National Guardsmen would never have done this. They never would have singled out 4 American women to kill. From the beginning, too, the Salvadoran government wanted to make clear that those guardsmen acted on their own. See, because they wanted military aid.
Military aid. Jimmy Carter, a president committed to human rights, had suspended the aid immediately after their deaths. But that pause didn't last long. And how quickly does the aid resume?
It was resumed on December 17th.
2 weeks after the women were found dead, $20 million in economic aid resumed.
And there was outrage in the United States.
Cynthia went to Washington, D.C. to protest with an organization called the Religious Task Force.
We went on a bus. A big bus went from Cleveland, filled with people, to go to this protest. And I remember it so well because it was just so moving with seeing so many people, the crowds. And we carried coffins, cardboard coffins of the 4 women, and had their names on the side. And we had a huge assembly at the Washington Monument. Now, by then, Carter was out. This was before Reagan was inaugurated.
The women had been murdered in December, while Carter was on his way out. Reagan was inaugurated the next month, in January of 1981. And despite those protests, he would continue to send aid to El Salvador.
Good evening. The Reagan administration today won preliminary approval in the Senate for its plans to increase military aid to El Salvador.
The Reagan administration approved a huge increase in military funding. Ambassador White began to speak out very publicly and criticize this continued aid. And he quickly became an enemy of Reagan's administration. Here he is testifying before Congress.
The security forces in El Salvador have been responsible for the deaths of thousands and thousands of young people. Are we really going to send military advisors in there to be part of that type of machinery?
Ambassador White openly criticized the government's investigation into the women's deaths.
And he told me that the department wanted White to certify that there was progress in these investigations, and he refused because he said that simply was not true. And White said he wouldn't have any part in a cover-up. And that decision not to participate in the cover-up cost him his job.
2 weeks after Reagan was inaugurated, Robert White was fired. White felt that the Reagan administration was downplaying the Salvadoran government's involvement in the killings because they wanted to support their ally in the proxy Cold War.
I think that the Reagan administration is so completely transfixed by their interpretation of Central America, that it's an East-West conflict, that they are ready to embrace anyone, no matter how reprehensible, as long as he or she will say that they are anti-communist.
He also pointed to statements made by government officials about the nuns. Statements that implied that the nuns weren't just innocent victims, but part of the guerrilla, or that they had been killed by accident. This is Jeane Kirkpatrick, ambassador to the UN. I'll warn you, the tape is a little hard to hear.
The nuns were clearly not just nuns. The nuns were also political activists. We ought to be a little more clear-cut about this than we usually are.
It's hard to hear in the tape, so I'll say it again because it's worth repeating for just how tone-deaf it is. The nuns were not just nuns. The nuns were also political activists. She made this comment on December 25th of 1980, just weeks after the rape and murder of the 4 churchwomen. And then there was Alexander Haig, Secretary of State, who just a few months later told Congress, perhaps the vehicle in which the nuns were riding may have tried to run a roadblock or may have accidentally been perceived to do so, and that there had been exchange of fire, implying that the nuns had guns of their own and had been in a shootout. Cynthia and her fellow sisters remember hearing these public comments.
And we were just outraged, and we have a whole file of letters that some of our sisters wrote. Mother Bartholomew wrote a searing letter to Jeane Kirkpatrick. She was a very wonderful, quiet, soft-spoken, gentle person, and yet she wrote this letter really accusing Jeane Kirkpatrick. It was just outrageous that the nuns would have guns and would have exchanged fire. And also that they were leftists. You know, our mission team, they stayed out of politics, and they were there to be pastoral ministers and later to help the refugees, to give them food, to give them medicine. You know, they were not to be involved in politics.
For years on end, this charade went on. The U.S. would dangle its aid package in front of the Salvadorans and say, you need to show us that you're making progress on this investigation, threatening to stop aid. And the Salvadorans would call their bluff. They'd say, sure, we're looking into it, and make no progress. Inevitably, another $100 million check would get sent. The Reagan administration would end up sending over $4 billion to El Salvador, basically funding the entire Civil War.
Robert White also told me, quote, that when the Reagan administration reached the conscious decision not to pursue this issue, meaning the churchwomen's murders, with the Salvador military, they were giving a very clear signal to the military that we would not try to hold them accountable for civilian deaths, whether they were foreigners or whether they were Salvadorans, end of quote.
I mean, if the U.S. government wasn't willing to protect their own citizens and was willing to defame nuns who are raped and murdered, what hope do the Salvadoran people have? I mean, honestly, there's no other way to interpret that. Eventually, there would be some sort of justice. Once the Cold War connection and the allyship was no longer necessary to the U.S. 5 National Guardsmen, including Colindre Alemán, would be charged with the women's killings in the spring of 1981. It would take many years, but they would eventually go on trial.
1984, the 5 men named responsible for the murders of the churchwomen went on trial and were found guilty of murder and sentenced to 30 years imprisonment.
The head of the Salvadoran National Guard, Vides Casanova, spent years freely living in the U.S. So did the Salvadoran Minister of Defense, José Guillermo Garcia. the one who White claims asked him if the nuns wore habits.
Vides Casanova was in charge of the National Guard. They were in command when the women were killed and when a lot of other atrocities were taking place.
After 10 years of lawsuits, in 2015, human rights groups finally succeeded in getting the U.S. government to deport Vides Casanova for the killing and torture that happened under his command, including the killing of the 4 churchwomen. The next year, Jose Guillermo Garcia was deported too, for his role in extrajudicial killings, including the killing of Oscar Romero. These were some of the few government officials who saw consequences for the human rights abuses that happened during the war. Which got at something that's bothered me since I started this reporting. What happened to these 4 women is unspeakably horrible. That's without question. But at the very least, there was an investigation done to hold their killers to account. But what about the thousands of Salvadorans whose lives were also lost? The ones whose names never appeared in a newspaper? Didn't their lives matter? Without the U.S. involvement, the Salvadoran Civil War does not happen. At least, not to the scale that it did. El Salvador was just a pawn in a much larger game. And the lives lost were just nameless casualties to the politicians in D.C. Dorothy's family member, Joseph Kazel, would later tell the Washington Post, "At least this is some justice being done. I don't know if there'll be enough justice done for them. They killed the 4 missionary girls, but how many other people they killed? That's another question." After their deaths, a service was held for the churchwomen in El Salvador. We've spent this entire episode talking about Dorothy's story, the fullness of her life. But she was only one of the 4 killed. Maura Clark, Ida Ford, and Jean Donovan's lives were just as full, just as meaningful. They left their mark on the people around them. A Salvadoran priest that I interviewed told me that there are still little girls named Ida in his parish. The reason why Cynthia has so much detail about Dorothy's life is because Dorothy left these tapes behind. Tapes of the things that she witnessed, the things she felt and saw during her time in El Salvador.
Lots of things have been happening that I want to tell you about. And again, I wish you would hold on to this tape for me.
She sent them to a friend of hers, trusting her to keep her words and her record of her life in El Salvador. She wanted to remember everything she'd seen, but not scare her parents.
Please don't tape over it. Just save it for me.
Remember the way that each day, she and her sisters did what they could. Each day they lived with Salvadorans who never knew, moment to moment, if they were safe.
So, to this day, we don't know, and who knows that we'll ever know. But, the poor, poor families. That was really a grueling thing for us. But it's over with, and, we're still living with the sin of it.
On the next episode, my family finally tells me the story of what pushed them to leave El Salvador.
Fue un sábado, cuando se supone que mataron a mi hermana, porque yo todavía iba en camino y no sabía, había manera de que yo supiera que ella había fallecido, que a ella la habían matado. Yo ya no la volví a ver jamás.
That's next time on Nation of Saints. Sacred Scandal, Nation of Saints is a production of AHA Podcasts in partnership with iHeart's My Cultura podcast network and is hosted and written by me, Jasmine Romero. Produced by Jasmine Romero, Sofia Palitza Carr, Reynolds Gutierrez, with help from Jorge Just and Alvaro Cespedes. Research and reporting by Jasmine Romero. Edited by Zaire Quevedo, Jorge Just, and Rose Reed. Nation of Saints was recorded in New York City at the Relic Room, with engineering by Sam Baer. Mixing and sound design by Pachi Quiñones. Original music by Golden Minds, Darko and Aime, based on Patrick Hart's original composition. Fact-checking by Erendira Aquino Ayala. Executive producers are Carmen Graterol, Isaac Lee, Rose Reed, and Nando Villa. Our executive producers at iHeart are Giselle Bances and Arlene Santana. Sacred Scandal was created by Melanie Bartley and Paula Barros. Special thanks to Cynthia Glavick, Joanne Gross, and the Ursuline Sisters of Cleveland. The recordings of Dorothy Kazel in this episode were provided courtesy of the Ursuline Sisters of Cleveland Archives. For more podcasts, go to the iHeartRadio app or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.